The afternoon sun filtered through the crystal chandeliers of the Riverside Country Club's main dining room, casting elegant patterns across the pristine white tablecloths and gleaming silverware. From my seat near the windows, I had a perfect view of the manicured golf course that stretched toward the river, its emerald fairways dotted with perfectly placed sand traps and water hazards. I'd chosen this table deliberately, not just for the view, but because it offered the best vantage point to observe the family reunion lunch that was taking place across the dining room. My extended family had gathered to celebrate my grandmother's 80th birthday, and as usual, I was watching from a distance rather than participating directly. The Williams family had always been complicated. Old money, old traditions, and very old prejudices about who belonged and who didn't. My grandmother Eleanor had married my grandfather in 1962, bringing together two established families with deep roots in the community. Their children and grandchildren had grown up expecting certain privileges, certain social positions, and certain standards of behavior. I had never quite fit their definition of appropriate family behavior. "Sophia, darling, you look lovely," my Aunt Patricia called out as I approached their large table, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she was being polite but not particularly welcoming. Patricia was my father's sister, a woman who had married well and spent the past 30 years perfecting the art of social positioning. My cousin Bradley, Patricia's son, looked up from his conversation with obvious reluctance. "Oh. Hi, Sophia. I didn't expect to see you here." "It's grandmother's birthday," I replied simply, settling into the one empty chair at the far end of the table. "Of course I'd be here." "Of course," echoed my cousin Miranda, Bradley's sister, though her tone suggested she found my presence more surprising than inevitable. "How are things going with your ventures?" The way she said ventures made it clear she was referring to my work with the same tone she might use to discuss an embarrassing hobby or a regrettable life choice. "Things are going well," I said, accepting a menu from the server without elaborating further. My family had never quite understood what I did for a living, despite my attempts to explain it over the years. They knew I worked in technology, they knew I traveled frequently for business, and they knew I lived modestly in a small apartment rather than the grand house they thought someone from our family should occupy. What they didn't know was the full scope of what I'd built over the past 8 years. "Sophia's still doing that computer consulting thing," my Uncle Charles explained to his wife as if I weren't sitting right there. Charles was my father's brother, a successful lawyer who had inherited the family's real estate investments and had been living comfortably off the proceeds for decades. "How interesting," his wife Margaret replied with the kind of polite disinterest that suggested she found it anything but interesting. My grandmother, the guest of honor, smiled at me warmly from her seat at the head of the table. "Sophia dear, tell us about your recent travels. Patricia mentioned you were in Asia again." "I was in Singapore and Tokyo for a few weeks," I confirmed, "working with some international clients." "Still doing that freelance work?" Bradley asked, and I could hear the subtle condescension in his voice. At 32, Bradley worked for his father-in-law's investment firm and had never failed to remind family gatherings that he was building something substantial rather than playing around with computers. "Something like that," I said quietly. The conversation moved on to other topics. Miranda's upcoming charity gala, Charles's latest golf tournament, Patricia's new interior designer. I listened with half an ear while studying the room around us, noting the details that had become familiar over the past 18 months. The Riverside Country Club had been the social center of our community for over a century. Founded in 1895, it occupied 200 acres of prime real estate along the river, with an 18-hole championship golf course, tennis courts, swimming pools, and dining facilities that rivaled the finest restaurants in the city. Membership was exclusive, expensive, and passed down through families like a precious heirloom. My family had been members since the 1940s, when my great-grandfather had first achieved the social status necessary to gain admission. The club represented everything they valued: tradition, exclusivity, and the kind of social connections that opened doors and created opportunities. It was also, as of 18 months ago, mine. "The salmon is excellent today," my grandmother said, interrupting my thoughts. "Sophia, you should try it." "I'll probably just have the salad," I replied, though not because of cost considerations as my family undoubtedly assumed. "Still watching the budget?" Miranda asked with false sympathy. "It must be difficult managing finances when you don't have a steady income." I looked at my cousin, a woman who had never worked a day in her life but who felt qualified to lecture me about financial responsibility, and smiled. "I manage." Have you thought about looking for something more stable? Bradley asked. I mean, the freelance lifestyle might seem exciting when you're young, but eventually you need to build towards something permanent. Something with benefits, Patricia added helpfully. Health insurance, retirement planning. The things that really matter as you get older. I was 30 years old, hardly ancient, but my family had a talent for making me feel like an irresponsible child whenever we gathered together. I have benefits, I said simply. Through some kind of freelancer association? Charles asked, clearly trying to be helpful despite his obvious skepticism about my career choices. Something like that. The truth was more complicated than they could imagine. At 15, I'd started coding as a hobby, teaching myself programming languages and building simple applications for fun. By 18, I was creating websites for local businesses to help pay for college. By 22, I'd developed a mobile app that had been acquired by a major tech company for $12 million. That acquisition had provided the seed money for what became Williams Digital Solutions, a consulting firm that specialized in helping traditional businesses integrate advanced technology systems. Over the past 8 years, WDS had grown from a one-person operation run out of my apartment to a company with 47 employees and offices in 6 countries. But my family still thought I was struggling to make ends meet as a freelance computer consultant. Well, my grandmother said diplomatically, I'm proud of all my grandchildren for following their own paths. Of course, grandmother, Miranda said quickly. We all support Sophia's choices. The word choices hung in the air with the same dismissive weight that ventures had carried earlier. Speaking of choices, Bradley said, leaning back in his chair with obvious satisfaction, I have some exciting news to share with everyone. All attention turned to my cousin, who was clearly relishing his moment in the spotlight. Jennifer and I just put in an offer on the Morrison estate, he announced proudly. If everything goes through, we'll be moving into one of the most prestigious properties in the city. The table erupted in congratulations and excited questions. The Morrison estate was indeed one of the most sought-after properties in our area. A sprawling mansion on 20 acres with views of both the river and the city skyline. How wonderful! Patricia exclaimed. Bradley, that's such an achievement. Your father and I are so proud. The asking price was substantial, Bradley continued, but with my position at the firm and Jennifer's family connections, we were able to secure very favorable financing. And of course, Miranda added, it's the kind of property that makes a statement about your place in the community. I listened to the excited chatter about my cousin's real estate acquisition, remembering the phone call I'd received from my investment advisor just 2 weeks earlier. Sophia, he'd said, the Morrison estate is finally coming on the market. I know you expressed interest in it last year. Are you still considering making an offer? I'd been considering it for more than a year, actually. The estate was beautiful, but more importantly, it represented exactly the kind of investment that aligned with my long-term business strategy. The property included not just the main house, but also several outbuildings that could be converted into office space for WDS's North American headquarters. Yes, I told my advisor. Put in an offer. Full asking price, cash, no contingencies. Sophia, that's a $40 million property. I'm aware of the price, I'd replied. Can we close within 2 weeks? Apparently, my offer had been accepted before Bradley's financing had been approved. Sophia, you're being very quiet, my grandmother observed. What do you think of Bradley's wonderful news? I think the Morrison estate is a beautiful property, I said honestly. Whoever ends up buying it will be very fortunate. Well, that'll be us, Bradley said with obvious satisfaction. Jennifer's father knows the seller personally, so we're confident our offer will be accepted. I nodded and smiled, saying nothing about the fact that the property had already been sold to someone else. The conversation continued through the main course, with Bradley holding court about his real estate triumph and his plans for renovating the estate to better suit his family's needs. Miranda shared updates about her charity work, all volunteer positions that allowed her to network with other wealthy women without actually earning an income. Charles discussed his latest golf achievements. Patricia detailed her upcoming Mediterranean cruise. Nobody asked me about my work, my travels, or my plans for the future. I'd become accustomed to being the family member who listened rather than shared, who observed rather than participated. I'll be right back, I said, excusing myself from the table. I want to freshen up before dessert. I made my way to the ladies' lounge, an elegant space with marble countertops and crystal mirrors that reflected the club's old-world atmosphere. As I was washing my hands, I heard the door open behind me. Can you believe she actually came? Miranda's voice carried clearly in the tiled space. I looked up to see Miranda and Patricia entering the lounge, clearly not realizing I was already there. I thought she might skip this one, Patricia replied. These family gatherings must be so uncomfortable for her. Well, she can't afford to go anywhere else for a nice meal, Miranda said with a laugh. This is probably the only time she gets to eat somewhere decent. It's sad really, Patricia added. She's 30 years old with no real career, no husband, no prospects. Living in that tiny apartment, pretending that computer hobby of hers is a real business. At least she's trying, Miranda said, though her tone suggested this was damning with faint praise. Even if she's not very successful at it. I cleared my throat softly and both women turned to see me standing at the sink. Their faces went red with embarrassment. Sophia, Patricia said quickly. We were just having a private conversation, I finished calmly. I understand. I dried my hands deliberately and walked past them toward the door, but Miranda's voice stopped me. Sophia, you know we support you, right? We're family. We want you to succeed. I turned back to look at my aunt and cousin, seeing the mixture of guilt and condescension in their expressions. I know exactly what you want, I said quietly and left the lounge. When I returned to the dining room, dessert was being served. My grandmother's favorite chocolate cake from the club's renowned pastry chef. The conversation had moved on to Miranda's upcoming charity auction, but I could feel the tension from the three women at the table. Sophia, my grandmother said warmly, I ordered you a piece of the chocolate cake. I know it's your favorite too. Thank you, grandmother, I said, genuinely touched by her thoughtfulness. So tell me, Eleanor continued, when will you be traveling again? I worry about you being away so much. I'll probably be going to London next month, I said. And then Berlin in the spring. More consulting work? Charles asked, though his tone suggested he was struggling to understand what kind of consulting required so much international travel. Yes, we're expanding our European operations. We. Bradley caught the pronoun immediately. My company, I clarified. Williams Digital Solutions. I thought you were freelancing, Miranda said, still looking uncomfortable from our encounter in the lounge. I was initially. But the business has grown over the years. How grown? Bradley asked, and I could hear genuine curiosity in his voice for the first time all afternoon. Before I could answer, Robert Chin, the club's general manager, appeared at our table. Robert had been managing the Riverside Country Club for 5 years, transforming it from a slightly outdated institution into one of the most prestigious and profitable private clubs in the region. Good afternoon, everyone, Robert said with his usual professional smile. I hope you're all enjoying Mrs. Williams's birthday celebration. Everything has been lovely, Robert, my grandmother replied. Please give our compliments to the chef. I certainly will. Robert's attention turned to me. Ms. Williams, I wanted to let you know that the quarterly reports you requested are ready for your review. Should I have them sent to your usual table? The table went completely silent. I could feel every pair of eyes staring at me, could sense the confusion and growing suspicion in the air. That would be fine, Robert, I said calmly. Thank you. Of course. And the renovations to the East Wing are proceeding on schedule. The new private dining rooms should be ready for the spring season. Excellent. I'll want to see the progress tomorrow. I'll arrange a walkthrough for 10 a.m. if that works for you. After Robert left, the silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Finally, Bradley found his voice. Sophia, he said slowly, what quarterly reports is he talking about? I took a sip of my coffee, considering how much to reveal. The truth was going to come out eventually. My family would figure out what was happening when Bradley's real estate deal fell through and he started asking questions. The club's quarterly financial reports, I said simply. Why would you need to review the club's financial reports? Patricia asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to suspect the answer. Because I own the club. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear conversations from other tables, could hear the distant sound of golf carts on the course outside, could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. You what? Miranda whispered. I own the Riverside Country Club, I repeated calmly. I purchased it 18 months ago when the previous ownership group decided to sell. Bradley's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. You bought the country club? The real estate, the facilities, the golf course, and the business operations, I confirmed. It's been one of Williams Digital Solutions' most successful investments. Charles was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Williams Digital Solutions owns the Riverside Country Club? Among other properties, I said. We've been diversifying into hospitality and real estate as part of our long-term growth strategy. How much did it cost? Patricia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. $68 million, I replied. Though we've invested another $12 million in renovations and improvements since then. My grandmother was the first to recover from the shock. She began laughing, a warm, delighted sound that filled the sudden silence. Sophia dear, she said, her eyes twinkling with amusement, I think you've been keeping secrets from your family. Just a few, I admitted. A few. Bradley repeated. You own an $80 million country club and you call that a few secrets? The club is just one asset, I said. Williams Digital Solutions has a diversified portfolio. How diversified? Charles asked, though he looked like he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. I pulled out my phone and opened the summary report my CFO had sent me that morning. Currently, WDS has assets of approximately $2.4 billion, I said, reading from the report. We employ 847 people across 6 countries, and our annual revenue last year was $340 million. The silence returned, deeper and more stunned than before. You're a billionaire, Miranda said finally. On paper, I confirmed. Most of the value is tied up in business assets and real estate investments. Like the Morrison estate? Bradley asked, and I could see the dawning realization in his eyes. Among others, I said. We closed on the Morrison property last week. It'll be converted into our North American headquarters and research facility. Bradley's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on an unhealthy shade of gray. You bought the Morrison estate out from under me? I made a better offer, I said gently. Full asking price, cash, no contingencies. In business that usually wins. But you let me talk about it all through lunch, he said, his voice rising. You let me tell everyone about my real estate triumph, knowing that you'd already bought the property. You didn't ask if I knew anything about it, I pointed out. And I didn't want to spoil grandmother's birthday celebration with family drama. Patricia was shaking her head in disbelief. All this time we thought you were struggling. We thought you needed help. I know what you thought, I said, remembering the conversation I'd overheard in the ladies' lounge. I heard Miranda and you discussing my financial situation earlier. Miranda's face went bright red. Sophia, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. That I was successful? I interrupted. No, you didn't. Because you never asked. You made assumptions based on the fact that I drive a modest car and live in a small apartment. Why do you live in a small apartment if you can afford anything you want? Charles asked, genuinely puzzled. Because I don't need a mansion, I said simply. I travel more than half the year for business. When I'm home, I want a comfortable space that's easy to maintain, not a showcase property. And the car? Patricia asked. It's efficient and reliable. I don't need to impress anyone with my transportation choices. My grandmother was still smiling, clearly enjoying the revelation and its impact on the rest of the family. Sophia, she said, I have to ask, when you were growing up, did you ever imagine you'd end up owning the place where we've been having family celebrations for decades? Actually, I said, that was part of the appeal. This club has been important to our family for generations. When I learned it was for sale, I wanted to make sure it would continue to be available for occasions like this. So you bought it for sentimental reasons? Miranda asked. Partly, but mostly because it was a sound business investment. The club was undervalued and underutilized. We've increased membership, improved the facilities and expanded the services. It's now one of the most profitable private clubs in the region. Robert appeared at the table again, carrying a leather portfolio. Ms. Williams, here are those quarterly reports. And I wanted to mention that we've received 3 more applications for corporate memberships this week. Excellent. We'll review them at next week's board meeting. After Robert left, Bradley looked at me with something that might have been respect mixed with residual shock. Sophia, I owe you an apology. I've been treating you like you were. He paused, searching for the right words. Like I was unsuccessful? I suggested. Like you were unsuccessful, he admitted. I was wrong. Very wrong. We all were, Patricia added quietly. Sophia, I'm sorry for the things I said, the assumptions I made. And I'm sorry for what I said in the ladies' room, Miranda said, looking genuinely ashamed. It was cruel and unfair. I looked around the table at my family members, seeing the mixture of embarrassment, curiosity, and newfound respect in their expressions. I don't need apologies, I said finally. But I would like to suggest that maybe we could try to know each other better going forward. Real conversations about what we're actually doing with our lives, not just assumptions based on appearances. I'd like that, my grandmother said warmly. Sophia, would you tell us about your company? I'd love to understand what you've built. For the next hour, I found myself actually participating in a family conversation for the first time in years. I told them about Williams Digital Solutions, about the clients we worked with, about the challenges and rewards of building a global technology company. They asked thoughtful questions about my work, my travels, and my plans for the future. For the first time since I'd become successful, I felt like my family was genuinely interested in who I was rather than who they thought I should be. As the afternoon wound down and people began gathering their things to leave, Bradley approached me privately. Sophia, I have to ask, are there any other properties I should know about before I make offers on them? I laughed. I'll have my assistant send you a list of our real estate holdings, just to avoid any future awkwardness. That would be appreciated, he said with a rueful smile. And Sophia, congratulations on everything you've built. I may not understand how you did it, but I can see that it's impressive. 3 months later, I was hosting my first family gathering as the official owner of the Riverside Country Club. My grandmother's birthday celebration had been so successful that we decided to make it a quarterly tradition. This time, however, the dynamic was completely different. Instead of sitting at the far end of the table as an afterthought, I was at the center of conversations about business, investments, and future plans. My family members asked for my advice on their own financial decisions and seemed genuinely interested in learning from my experiences. The most significant change was in how they treated my work. Instead of dismissing my computer hobby, they now referred to Williams Digital Solutions with the respect usually reserved for major corporations, which I supposed we had become. Sophia, my grandmother said as we were finishing dessert, I want to thank you for saving our club. I was so worried when the previous owners announced they were selling. I thought we might lose this special place. I'm glad I could help preserve it, I said. But grandmother, we haven't just preserved it, we've made it better. The improvements we've implemented have enhanced the experience for all our members, including the family members who spent years underestimating the new owner, Patricia added with a self-deprecating smile. Especially those family members, I agreed with a grin. As I looked around the table at my family, people who now knew me for who I really was rather than who they'd assumed I was, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought us to this point. The years of being underestimated had taught me to value authentic success over external recognition. The experience of building something meaningful while being dismissed had made me stronger and more focused. But most importantly, I'd learned that the best way to change people's perceptions wasn't to announce your achievements. It was to quietly build something so substantial that it spoke for itself. The Riverside Country Club continued to thrive under my ownership, becoming not just a profitable business venture but a symbol of what could be accomplished when you believed in your own vision despite other people's doubts. And every time I sat at my usual table looking out at the golf course that had become one of my most satisfying investments, I remembered the whispered comment that had started it all. She can't afford to be here. Now, of course, nobody could afford to be there without my permission. But more importantly, I'd created a place where my family could gather and celebrate not just birthdays and achievements, but the deeper understanding that success comes in many forms, and that sometimes the quietest person at the table has the most interesting story to tell.